Hi, everybody. Whew, I'm doing this. Um, okay, so this has been on my heart the past few weeks to share my story. Um, I don't think I realized it was God nudging me because I kept pushing it under the rug. I was like, no, not because I have a problem sharing my story, but it's just the idea of like telling a testimony in my group just felt like I didn't want it to be about me, but then I realized but our testimonies are never about us. They're always about God. So once that came over me, I was like, okay, this feels right. So I hope that in this, I don't want to glorify the pain of my past. I want to glorify Jesus. And I hope in this you see Jesus in every single part of my story. Um, and that at the end you feel moved, and I would love to talk about it or whatever. So, okay, I did have to write everything down because if I don't, then I will get off on tangents and there's just too much to this story, and we would be here all night. So, this helps me stay focused. All right, so as you guys know, I grew up in a super loving, supportive home, pretty much about as good as you can get, but missing one really big thing, which was Jesus. So I had to construct my own moral compass throughout my upbringing. And the problem with that is when you're creating your own code of morality, that requires experimenting until something feels right, right? So my life was kind of a series of failed experiments. I dipped my toe in many, many pools until I found some that were warm enough. But really, that's just because someone had peed in them. So false sense of warmth and comfort basically. With every pool I swam in, I took on a new identity until I had about 10. But not surprisingly, I lived life very confused. I was depressed often, almost to the point of torment at times. The first memory I have from childhood is a friend and her boisterous Italian family constantly commenting on how sensitive I was. But let's be real, my friend was just like a massive bully too, but I was very sensitive. Nevertheless, I took on that identity fully and completely, owned it. I was the oversensitive girl, and it wasn't the last time I would hear that, and I didn't realize how much it was damaging me. So walking through life without Jesus with a heart as fragile and tender as mine was really tough. There were mornings I would wake up miserable, sobbing, unwilling to be pleasant with anyone in my family, even though I went to bed happy as a clam the night before. I remember just constantly being so overwhelmed and confused by why I was so unhappy all the time. Because I had no reason to be unhappy. And I knew, I know that kids, their brains are developing and all these things, but and they're going to throw temper tantrums and stuff like that. But I just knew, like from a young child all the way to like forever, young adulthood, that like something wasn't right. Just something was not right. So one night, example, I saw my trophies waving at me. My closet door handles were shaking. I swear, guys, this was actually happening. And shadows were moving around my room. And I knew it was real. And now I know for sure I came into contact with the spiritual world that night. So my story is one of heartbreak after heartbreak, but it's also one of God's refusal to never give up on me. So we'll start there. Just a warning, this is like some sensitive stuff, so I don't know, just trigger warning, I guess. Okay, by age 12, I had my first boyfriend. He was 2 years older than me and was a total player, but I was in denial. I held on to that for 2 years. He just total player, but also really like critical and all kinds of stuff anyway. He would say things to my brother to provoke Andy to try to like piss him off about stuff that he and I did that never happened. So that relationship kind of became my template. It was honestly normal, stupid 14-year-old boy stuff, but like I shouldn't have been dating someone at age 12, right? But so that was my template. Like that started all of it. And I have to bring my dad into this. I love my dad. He is the best. And he really did a great job with the tools he had. But he was really silent about my dating life, and he wasn't really the overprotective dad that I needed. He kind of let mom handle all the boy stuff because those conversations, heck no, super uncomfortable. Um, my dad's Achilles heel is criticism and pessimism, and he would be the first to admit that. But that came out at my brother and me often. So because of that, I learned to never stand up for myself, because if I did, there would be really big consequences. I expected wrath because that's what I got from dad if I ticked him off. And this carried over into my relationships with men. Dad is a great man, he just has a temper. In the 7th grade, I was invited to a friend's VBS. I wanted to blend in. I didn't want anyone to know I was a Christian because I really feared judgment. I mean, I lived in the Bible Belt, so I already had an awareness at that time that like me and like our family, we were kind of like ducks out of water, you know. Everyone went to church, we didn't. So my worst nightmare came true that night. It's a much longer story than I have time for, but that day ended in me being tricked into getting saved and lots of tears from the woman who thought she had brought me to Jesus. Her tears were tears of joy, and mine were tears of wrath and rage, because she had shoved a Jesus down my throat that I didn't ask for and I didn't want and I didn't think I needed. So from that point on, in my eyes, Christians were very presumptuous and condescending and self-righteous, and so I just had no interest until I met my best friend Sarah, my freshman year of high school. I knew almost immediately there was something really special about her that I couldn't put my finger on. And then 2 weeks into our friendship, and she was already coming on family vacations with us, so we bonded really quickly. And the more I got to know her and her family, I finally understood what I had been sensing and seeing this whole time, and it was the God of the Bible, right? And not the God that we were referring to, which really just kind of means the universe. So Sarah's mom and dad ministered to me constantly, and her mom would sit with me like for hours and just speak the word over my life whenever I had one of my meltdowns, and it all was kind of like foreign to me. I remember I just kind of like took it, but I wasn't rejecting it either. Like there was something about the way they delivered it. It was just the love of God pouring out of them, you know? Sarah was exceedingly patient with me. She had this maturity about her that just like boggled my mind. Like, how can you be, you know, 13, 14, 15, whatever year old girl and be this stable? Like, I like, it just didn't make any sense to me. And I wanted a little bit of what she had. So I was drawn to her like a moth to a light. I probably idolized her honestly for a period of time before I developed my own relationship with God. But so anyway, she and her family ran a home ministry, and so I started attending those fellowships every Sunday morning at their home. And eventually I took a couple classes to go deeper, and I really don't remember much, but what I remember is that my heart was like kind of opening to God quite a bit. But I didn't have a relationship with him because I didn't know how. And I would learn years later that my faith was, you know, it was a straw man. It was a good start, but very flimsy, because as soon as Sarah moved to a different state, I also moved away from God. Different kind of move. But seeds were planted, right? So in the meantime, I was still very, very caught up with dating guys who took advantage of me. One guy in my theater class who was dating another girl at the time took me home from school one day, and he made me do something I did not want to do. I was 16 and it was traumatic. And slowly but surely, I started to equate romantic feelings and later even love with sex and sexual things. I fully settled into my identity as an object, as someone who had to give a man what he wanted before I could get what I wanted, which was love. But I never received my end of the deal. So my mom and I had a terrible argument one night when I was 17. When she went to bed and the lights went out, I snuck downstairs to the medicine cabinet, grabbed a bottle of Advil, took every pill in that bottle. It wasn't a whole bottle, but it was a lot. I thought I wanted to die, but I didn't. What I wanted was a scare. I wanted a trip to the emergency room because I couldn't communicate to people how much pain I was in. And I wanted people, it was a cry for help. I wanted people to understand. But the problem was, because I had such big emotions that no one, I don't know, I never felt like anyone understood. I I think it was just seemed like drama to them. And when I say them, I'm really talking about my family. And so it was kind of like brushing. It's not that they didn't freak out about that when they learned that happened, but like you would think after that, like, okay, we need to put you in counseling, but that didn't happen, right? So it was just kind of like dismissed. So I woke up that morning perfectly healthy because God. Anyway, Sarah and her family moved away to Colorado my freshman year of college, right before my closest guy friend, who was like a brother to me, died suddenly in a car wreck. I stopped attending fellowships. I couldn't do it without Sarah because she was the only Christian friend I had. I partied a lot, countless blackout nights, experimenting with hallucinogens, and smoking exorbitant amounts of weed. By my junior year, I met Paul. So Paul was my first love. I was obsessed with this guy. I was a virgin at this point in my life, and he knew that. One night I could tell he was about to make the big move, and I told him I wasn't ready yet and that I would let him know when I was. He apologized and was very kind about it, but then the next weekend, he just, no warning, just did it. I didn't see it coming at all. And I tried to stop him, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. So my first experience with sex was, I guess, assault. Instead of breaking up with him, I made excuses for him. I convinced myself that it was what I wanted. And when we did break up, I ended up with a eating disorder it was a brief period of time, but I lost like 20 pounds in like a month because I was running like 40 miles a week and barely eating anything because I was so desperate for control. But anyway, at that moment, I became I just started to emotionally detach myself. So at age 20, I would attempt suicide again, but this time with a bottle of Mucinex, so a little more serious. But again, God, I was just ridiculously high all day long the next day. And it's kind of funny, but it's also not funny. But that was the only consequence. Excuse me. The next 11 years were much of the same story. It was date, hookup, breakup, date, hookup, breakup, heartbreak after heartbreak. Just taking on someone else's demons as if I didn't have enough of my own. Fast forward to 2015, I was 25, and that's when I met Conrad. Conrad was a student in my graduate program. We hit it off instantly, and he was kind of a corrective experience for me. Around year 3, so we had talked about, I say he was a corrective experience because he was a really good dude. But around year 3, we were starting to have some major issues. And we had talked about marriage and kids before, but I always got this sense that he didn't really want to talk about it. Like, it was just an uncomfortable topic for him, which made sense if you knew his upbringing and like where he came from. He didn't have the greatest experience with marriage and that, example in his home. But I thought we were having a kind of a corner turning moment when we were on spring break in the car in New Orleans. And I just boldly asked him, I said, hey, when do you think we'll have kids, get married and have kids? And I think I was 30 or 29 or 30 at the time. He said, I didn't even hesitate. He was like, I don't know, maybe like 32, 33. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right to me too. And like, okay, cool. And so I felt this big like release, like, okay, we're good, Well, a month later, we'd be sitting on the couch together at my apartment breaking up. A conversation that I did not expect at all. Suddenly, he didn't even know if he wanted to marry or have kids. So he left, and just like that, with no warning, I had to say goodbye to my best friend. Now I know that this was God's protection. Even though he was a great guy with a great heart, I dodged a bullet. But I went on a total shop for guys out of a catalog spree to fill the void that Conrad had left. And I put myself in some pretty dangerous situations that could have gone south very fast. And I would say each experience was a bit more degrading than the last. Whew, this one sucks. At my lowest point, I slept with a married man, and I had dated him years prior, before he got married. But my self-worth was just so low, and I was so desperate for love. I did not care about anyone. I just did not care about anybody. And it was kind of like well, what else am I worth? Like, so he was visiting Dallas. He lived in Houston, but was visiting Dallas for work. And he literally came over, it happened, and then he left. Like, I felt like such a cheap whore. And I also had that same year, not the same night, but I had my first hypomanic episode. So I'll tell you more about that later. So this all sounds super depressing, and it was, but it was at this point in my story that despair and brokenness began to intersect with a new path toward Jesus. I was having a quarter life crisis in grad school at the time. Every student in my program, all my friends, it's like they knew what they wanted to do whenever they got out of the program, but I just like still had no idea. And I thought for sure like that I would know, and I didn't. So I was freaking out. So one day I was just like, I just want to try something new. I'm bored. So I got this wild hair. I'm sitting in my lab, and I joined a multi-level marketing company called WealthWave. And started educating people about how money works and like selling them policies and all kinds of stuff. So a bit different than psychology. But I'm telling you, there is no better comedian than God, because every single person in that office was Mormon. But God used them to bring me back to God. They brought up God in their business talk often. And I know sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean anything. A lot of people do that. Like, I want to thank God. And it's like, okay. But like, you have to understand, I hadn't had like a conversation about God really in like 12 years at that point. And so it really stood out to me. So memories of my time with Sarah kind of would come flooding back, you know? So anyway, I went to church a couple of times with a friend, a Mormon church. Don't worry, I hated it. It was weird. But I was just hungry for God, and it was better than doing nothing at all. I also made a friend in my graduate program. She was a master's student though, so she was like 10 years my junior. But I was mentoring her. She actually ended up doing what I was doing at WealthWave, so we were like teammates. But she was a woman of faith, and I just remember being amazed because she had been through so much, but yet she still had such an amazing faith in God. And I was just like marveling over that. So I attended church with her a couple times too. And I don't remember having this big like altar call eureka moment, but I just remember slowly kind of falling in love with Jesus and calling Sarah and calling my aunt and being like, guess what? I'm a Christian. I'm in love with Jesus. And that's all I remember. So from that point on, so that was, I think, around January 2020. Unfortunately, that's when things got very real, very fast. So COVID hit, obviously, in March. And another friend of mine from the graduate program, not the same girl, came over to my apartment and showed me some things that kind of blew the lid off of everything I thought I always knew to be true. So government officials I'd always trusted, you know, I kind of lived in like the woke world, and just grew up in that culture and that environment, that push for the one world government, all this stuff, you know. So in other words, she done woke me up. And that evening I had my first supernatural experience, and it was not a pleasant one. I felt God literally just like lift the veil from my eyes, and I saw things for what they really were. And I knew in my heart of hearts that what I was seeing now was actually the real thing, like the spiritual battle that I didn't know was going on. So imagine, this is the best way I can explain it. Imagine every experience, belief, conversation you've ever had floating inside your body, like the stuff that you accumulate over time that informs your worldviews, your personality, your relationship dynamics. everything. And now imagine them all being emptied out of your body at one time, like a vacuum cleaner. That's what it felt like. I was empty and I didn't know what I was made up of anymore. So that night ended with me sitting in my corner in fetal position, rocking back and forth, sobbing. I was terrified. I was terrified because it, truly, I felt like I was in this white space, like this void. And I didn't have any footing or grounding anymore because everything I put my security in was like not real, you know? So my friend had to stay the night with me because I felt like I was basically staring down the eyes of the devil and I was terrified. I just didn't know such evil could exist. And I kind of feel like, obviously I met Jesus before, but my experience with the enemy was way more profound. Like, I feel like I met the devil before I really, really met Jesus, which I don't think is actually true, but it feels that way because of how powerful that night was. So I called Sarah and I was like, oh my God, is the world gonna end? Like, I haven't even had a chance to like walk out my faith yet, and my family's not saved, and oh my God, Jesus is coming back. Okay, so I'm freaking out, like just a brand new Christian, like literally just the world is spinning around me. And then I start, I'm going off on all these like what people call conspiracy theories, but aren't. So I was talking about all the child trafficking and all this stuff. And she was like, okay, I'm going to stop you right there. And she was like, call my mom, only because like she knows about all that stuff. I can't talk about it because I got kids. And I was like, okay, I understand. I'm sorry. So that got me reconnected with Sarah's parents. They lived in a small little town called Hamilton in Montana at the time. So from that point on, they were kind of like a lifeline that I was holding on to during such a turbulent time. And I was butting heads with my family because we were arguing, we just let like the politics and stuff just rip us apart. And honestly, I think I was the instigator. But so we were praying every single night. Melody and I were praying every night. And specifically, she was praying for a spouse for me. So she was praying for my husband. Not too long after that, on a visit to see my brother in Nashville, I get a text from Melody that she had found a man for me. She said he really loved God, but he lived in Hamilton. And I had just finished defending my dissertation by that point. So I thought, why not? I'll treat myself to a little mountain celebration. So to Montana I went. I didn't really have any high hopes. I was like, what are the chances that I'm going to hit it off with this like country bumpkin Montana guy, hunter, fisher? Like, that's not me at all. But we did. So we spent hours together, during the 5 days that I was there. We were convinced we were meant to be, and he was telling everyone in his hometown, his family, that he had met his wife and all of those things. So, having only been 3 months into my new life as a Jesus follower, I was not sanctified enough to approach this with wisdom. I thought this was God answering my prayer for a husband. So I thought this was God sending him to me. So I uprooted the life that I knew in Texas. I sold everything I had. Not only did I move to Montana, but I moved in with him, where I knew nobody except for Melody and Kevin. Okay, so his name was Josie. Josie owned his own business as an electrician, and he was a workaholic. He said all the right things and made huge promises about his plan to whittle down his hours so that we could start our lives together. And it was a really convincing plan. Everything was great for the first 2 months. Then he became distant, cold, and hardly even spoke to me. He worked from 4:30 a.m. until like 7:30 p.m. at night. While he was at work, I was at home furiously applying for jobs as a newly minted psychologist in the middle of the year 2020, funding his very expensive keto diet and taking care of the home. Like, we were literally playing house, and he had expressed interest in Christianity at one point. Like, he dabbled in it, and he was like, really cool things happened during that time in my life, and da da da. So it was missionary dating. That's all it was. So while this was happening, I received a call about a potential cervical cancer scare from my doctor in Dallas. I basically became the woman with the issue of blood for 2 months, and I had to undergo a very painful procedure on my own because no one was allowed in the doctor's room with me because of COVID. All the while heartbroken and alone because the man that I thought I would marry was slowly ghosting me, and I was about to be completely alone in a winter tundra with no one to talk to except for Sarah's parents. Thank God for them. But in all of this, I caused my family a lot of pain. We were fighting constantly, especially my brother and me. Actually, he and I stopped talking for 6 months, which is like freaking unheard of. My parents were extremely worried about me. I was going down a very dark hole with politics. It became my God. I lost all of my grad school friends, plus some, because of my beliefs. That ended up being a good thing later, but my parents wouldn't let me visit them for Christmas because they were scared of COVID. And I was trying to reconcile how my parents were so worried about me, how they could reject me like that because they were afraid of a virus. Like, I felt like they were more scared of that than they were like wanting to see me, if that makes sense. So the virus was scarier than I was important. That was what was going on in my head. I see it very differently now, but so I had entered what would be a dark 2 to 3 year season of intense isolation. So Josie and I were fighting all the time. I'm gonna check the time. Okay. And I was desperate to move out and get my own place and then figure out next steps from there. But I had no proof of income, so I couldn't secure a rental. Melody and Kevin hooked me up with their friends who were a super sweet Christian couple. They owned like a bunch of cabins. It was kind of like a campsite, but it was for hunters who came for the season to like store their meat and like whatever. And so they agreed to lease it out to me for a month, like an apartment. And so I moved what I could into that little cabin, still kind of fighting for my relationship with Josie, even though honestly he had given up a long time ago. I had no cell phone service or anything out there. I had to drive into the city just to talk to my family. And naturally, I spent most days with Melody and Kevin, and that was another thing. God provided. Like, I didn't have to pay. I had drained my account. I had no money. I didn't even know how I was going to pay rent once I ended up getting, like, I didn't know how any of this was going to work. We would talk about like leap of faith every single day. It was just freaking crazy. So the cabin was basically a place for me to rest my head at night and to keep this one, Cat. I don't know if you can see that is Cat. Okay. Josie never came to visit me one time up there to see if I was okay, if I needed anything, nothing. So towards the end of my lease, I joined Melody and Kevin on a 4-day Bible study retreat in the mountains. There was a guy close to my age there. My heart was breaking over Josie, knowing we were probably broken up because he wasn't really engaging with me. Although we'd never actually gotten together to have an adult conversation to say, we're broken up, right? Because this is getting weird. He wasn't responsive to me. So like he kind of tied my hands. So I had zero interest in this guy because my heart was elsewhere. But his name was Jonathan. Melody and another woman there who had known him since he was young were just singing his praises, that he was this great Christian man. I could tell he was interested in me, and I knew he was going to ask me for my number. And when he did, I agreed to give it to him, but I was very transparent, and I said, listen, I'm trying to make things work with my boyfriend, and so this is literally just a like brother in Christ, sister in Christ. Like, it would be nice to have a friend close to my age here. And he was like, understood. And he respected that. And like, I think I didn't hear from him until Halloween, like a couple weeks later. And all he said was like, happy Halloween. It was like nothing big. My lease at the cabin ended and I still had no place to go. So I moved in with Melody and Kevin for 2 weeks. I was still on the hunt for employment. And one day Melody and Kevin took a little road trip together and pulled to the side of the road, sat by the river and prayed. They prayed for work for Kevin. He was a carpenter and did contract work, and for me to find a home. Immediately, Kevin's phone rang. It was a woman named Donna, and she was asking for his help because she saw his ad on Facebook. So they immediately went to go see her house and kind of assess the work that she needed done. And then in their conversation, she casually mentioned like one of my other properties or whatever. And they were like, wait, you have another property? Is it available for rent? And it wasn't, but she pulled strings and she just agreed to make it happen. So long story short, even though her and her husband's stuff was strewn all over the place there, I didn't care. I just needed to get out. So the next day after securing this house, I got a job. The next day. I had been applying for months and no luck. The next day. So suddenly I could pay for rent. But there was only one problem. I still had a ton of my stuff over at Josie's. I had a key to his place, and he had told me that I could go over there at any time to get what I needed, whether he was home or not home. But that was like before he was kind of starting to like be weird and like ghost me. So nervously, because I was so sick to my stomach about like what he had done and how he just like literally like dropped me like that. I went over there while he was at work to get some clothes and kitchenware that I needed, but he had changed the locks. Like I was some crazy girl that was gonna come in and like, trash his place or something. All my stuff was in boxes and white trash bags underneath his staircase outside. He didn't tell me at all. So that was probably the most poignant moment that I can think of in that whole story. My whole time there is just like, I felt like my heart had been pulled out from my chest because I felt like a stray dog. Like he had just kicked me to the curb. Like, you're worthless, you're meaningless to me, get out. So I had a moment of weakness and I texted Jonathan. What started as small talk led to a weekend visit to my new house. He had some context for what had been happening in my life, but I was pretty guarded with it. I wasn't sharing everything. But what I did do was tell him this verbatim. Bring a sleeping bag because you will have to sleep on the floor in the living room. There will be no touching, no kissing, no nothing. My heart can't handle that right now. This is friendship only. Can we agree on that? His response was, you do not have to worry about that stuff with me. Your heart is safe. All right, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. He attacked me twice. I didn't even try to fight him off because I didn't have any left in me. It was bad. I could tell he watched a lot of pornography, and that's all I'll say about that. I couldn't get out of bed that weekend at all, and life just was not worth living anymore. I just remember my mind being consumed with thoughts of going to buy, Montana's like gun country, just going to buy guns and like blowing my head off. I remember having those thoughts like crazy. But it was at that moment in the pit of hell that I made Jesus my Lord. I made a vow to never date a man ever again unless he was my husband. I made a vow to do everything his way. I let him have me and all of me. Slowly but surely, right after I'd surrendered, things started to move. I'd been in Montana at that point for 6 months, and it would be another 4 months before I could leave. God lined that up so fast. I gave him a top 3 list, and Florida was on it. I gave God a list, that's funny. But he honored it. He opened the doors to Florida. Within just a few days, I had a roommate. I had been approved for a condo and had booked a moving truck. One day, just a week out before moving to Florida, I took my work with me to a nearby cafe, and Josie walks in. So I had managed to go months avoiding him in this tiny little town. I was terrified. Every time I went to the grocery store, anywhere public, I was so afraid I was going to run into him. And I managed to avoid him a week before I leave. It was awful. We make eye contact. I was like, I'm going to throw up. And he waves at me and comes, sits down with me as if nothing ever happened. All I could see was red. I was this close to escaping this horrible place without ever having to see him again. And he proceeded to ask me what I've been up to, Started talking about how he's, just kind of been taking it easy and not dating anyone, because he felt like people there were just too small-minded for him, etc. He didn't really say it like that, but that's basically what he was saying. I'm sitting there speechless. I have never been that angry before in my entire life, and I could not see straight. And somehow, I ended up getting out just how despicable his behavior was, but I wasn't happy with how I was saying it and how it was coming out. He reminded me of when he said he wanted to try and start from ground zero once I moved out as close friends to do things right, like get to know each other so that we could appreciate each other more, whatever. When he mentioned that, I was obviously not okay with that because I didn't leave my entire life behind so we could be friends. Like, that's crazy. So sitting across from me at that diner, he said, when you refused the friendship, I thought to myself, that's not love. Yeah. Next page. So he turned it around on me, and I was the problem. I had started healing a little bit, and now that wound had been ripped wide open again. But soon I would never have to see him ever again. So through the depth of my pain, I still prayed for him through gritted teeth. I could only do it because the Holy Spirit empowered me. I knew that he was just a hurt little boy, and that's why he was hurting me. So now I'm in Florida. I'm going to skip over all the drama that ensued when I first moved here because they're just little inconveniences that were kind of the cherry on top to all the burdens I was, carrying on my way into Florida. But God did come through in miraculous ways during that time. Supernatural financial provision, and saving me from scammers that I had booked. They had withheld my belongings for 2 months, and it was at that point where I was starting to see how good God was and how faithful he was. What I would quickly learn is that life does not get easier just because you start following Jesus when you've spent your life in perpetual sin, because the next phase is the healing phase, and the healing phase hurts. I was still pretty dang isolated. Most days and weekends were spent alone, although I was starting to meet people and developing some friendships, but I was the outsider. And it just takes a while to become fully assimilated. The first 3 years of my life as a believer were spent on my face. I cussed God out more times than I can count, and I bathed in heavenly bliss more times than I can count. The enemy of my soul did not like that I was wrestling with God and spending so much time with him. And that's when the mania that I experienced after my breakup with Conrad came back. But this time it was pretty frequent. I would get these huge bursts of energy and my mouth couldn't keep up with my thoughts. I wanted to clean the house and I couldn't sit down. I just had no control over it. And then the insomnia started like that. I was always like this rock star sleeper, and then suddenly, like literally one night, I just couldn't sleep at all, and then it just kept happening. And I had just started a new job as the head of the guidance counseling department at Orangewood Christian School, so I was helping kids with mental health issues when I was dealing with my own and sleep deprived. So that was ironic, but it gets even more ironic. One weekend after coming down from one of my manic episodes, I crashed into a very deep depression. I couldn't stop thinking about dying. The thoughts in my head were gruesome and disturbing. This wasn't new for me. I had dealt with that my whole life, but this time I really felt done. So I texted my friends. It was basically a suicide note, even though I don't remember what it said. And then I turned my phone off, so I really freaked them out. Before you know it, a cop had showed up at my door, and I was Baker acted. You want to talk about a humbling experience, a psychology PhD in charge of the counseling department at her school, and a new hire at that, having to have her mother call her boss to tell her what happened because I couldn't contact her. I didn't have Angel's number memorized. I wasn't allowed to have my cell phone on me. So humiliating, but check this out. So the first night I was there, the staff had to sit outside of my door and look into the little window every few minutes to make sure I wasn't doing anything to hurt myself. I didn't have my medication, so that made it even worse. But at some point in the middle of the night, an adorable little Latino man brought me a pillow upon my request, and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing here? Like, I just have to ask you, you're so young, you have so much going for you." And then he said, just know that you're here for a reason. God loves you. I was so annoyed, but there was also this little part of me that recognized that voice. And that was God whispering, I'm here and he's right. I do love you. They finally transferred me to the psych unit. When I realized that there were 2 to a room, I panicked. I was terrified I would end up with some crazy schizophrenic woman and I'd have to sleep with one eye open. But my roommate ended up being this young girl who was super sweet. We got along really well. Each day, a staff member would call the patients up to the pharmacy window and everyone would line up to pick up their meds. I waited until the line died down and went once everyone was gone. The guy looked at me and said, I don't know what happened, but I don't think you belong here. My mind immediately went back to what the first man had told me in the emergency room on my first night. I was very transparent with him about what had happened. He preceded me to give me the hookup to getting out. He gave me the code to dial out on the phone and instructed me to have my family leave a voice message for the social worker demanding my release. And it worked. I was released within 48 hours. The standard Baker Act hold is a mandatory 72 hours. So even though that was super unethical for that guy to do, he could have lost his job. Through natural eyes, one would think that this was very unwise for a patient who had threatened suicide. But God knew. He knew that what would transpire next, which was an awakening to who I am in him, that I'm not a dejected, lonely, pathetic little person with no hope. The hospital was actually one of the best things that has ever happened to me in getting free from my lifelong mental battle. It was step number 1 because the battle was far from over. I still struggled, but it was different, slightly better. Step number 2 sealed the deal. In a moment of desperation, this was post-hospital, I asked God to prove to me that he could heal my depression. I remember pacing around my apartment and just like, oh man, I was just like, Lord, I don't believe you. I want to believe that this can happen, but I don't believe that I can be free of this. So you have to prove it to me. Not too long after, I was fasting one weekend and I went to a coffee shop to do like a really intensive Bible study. And when I sat down, I asked God how he wanted me to use my time there. And I knew immediately to search for a man named Jaco Booyens. He's someone I'd been following for a while. Anyway, I found a sermon of his and it was all about resilience, recoiling back to the word of God when the devil backs you into a corner. Then he said the words that would change everything for me. So first he asked, are you still fighting the same battles that you fought a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? It's because the devil doesn't respect you yet. He respects Jesus in you, and he will respect you once he sees that you identify as a son or daughter of God. And all I can say is that I felt this holy rebellion bubble up within me, and I went home, I locked myself in my room, and I let that little snake who had tormented me my whole life just have it. And it's the first time I felt this like true release from the things that had been holding me captive. And guys, I still struggle sometimes, but not really. Like, it has really stuck to me. I haven't had a suicidal thought since. I can't even imagine. Like, it's so crazy. And that was 3 whole years ago. So like, I've been free for a while now. So here's what I want to leave you with, because I talk a lot. Okay. First, disobedience and bad choices, not good. Obviously, you see where that left me, but they did not deter God from pursuing me, saving me, and redeeming me. God isn't disappointed in you. He's elated by you. His love will far outlast your rebellion. He's in it for the long haul. When dealt with properly, this is point number 2, doubt can lead to faith. It means you're working to understand your faith at a deeper level. It can force us to wrestle with what we believe and why we believe it. It causes us to seek what is true and right. God is not afraid of your doubt. It doesn't disqualify you from living in faith. If you condemn yourself for doubting, it's the condemnation that is keeping you from experiencing the fullness of God, not the doubt itself. Point number 3, pay attention. Pay attention to the small things that he's doing in your life and don't take them lightly. God doesn't play small, but we do. Those small things, every little frustrating interaction, the sleepless nights, the subtle stirrings of your spirit are small for a reason, because that's the only way we can digest them, right? So know that God is stacking them up together so that we can look back and see how big he was playing with all of those little things. And then finally, while you're sitting wringing your hands, comparing your walk of faith to others, lamenting about how far he feels, he's sitting waiting for you to awaken to just how perfect you are to him. In his eyes, 100% of the time. If you can just join him in that and let him dote on you, focus on how much he loves you, all of that will line up behind it. It will bow down to him because you're made in his image and he is perfect love, and it is perfect love that casts out fear. So if he is perfect love and you are made in his image, then you are perfect love. That's who you are as a new creation. So align with perfect love and the dross will fall off. I love you guys. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk.